Welcome to the Forge Over 40 podcast. My name is Steve Didier, and this show is for high performers who refuse to let their edge quietly erode. If you've built companies, led teams, carried responsibility for decades, but lately your focus feels duller, decisions feel heavier, and your mental stamina isn't quite what it used to be, this is where we rebuild the biological systems that your leadership depends on, and we do it on a physiological level. So, let's talk about something that almost every high performer notices at some point after 40. Your energy changes. Your drive feels different. Your recovery slows down. You are still disciplined, still working hard, still showing up. But the internal engine that used to power your performance feels less reliable than it used to. And eventually, somebody's going to say it, hormones. Usually followed by one of two reactions. Either people assume hormones must be the whole problem, or they dismiss the idea entirely because their doctor told them that their labs look normal. Both of those reactions miss the real story, because what most people are experiencing isn't a single hormone crashing. It's a pattern of hormonal signaling drifting out of alignment. Cortisol rhythm begins flattening. Thyroid conversion becomes less efficient. Sex hormone signaling becomes weaker or less responsive. Individually, none of these changes look dramatic on a lab report, but collectively, they change how your entire physiology produces and manages energy. And that's why high performers start feeling something like their system isn't firing the way it used to. Now, here's what we need to confront very directly. The way hormone health is handled in mainstream medicine is deeply flawed for people who want to maintain high performance. Most physicians are trained to identify disease, not optimize physiology. That means the standard approach is very simple. Run a basic lab panel, compare it to a population reference range, and if that number falls somewhere inside that range, the conclusion is you're absolutely fine. But the range itself is incredibly wide, and it's built from averages across a general population that includes people who are overweight, sedentary, sleep-deprived, metabolically unhealthy, and under chronic stress. That's not exactly the benchmark that most high performers are aiming for. Yet, that's the standard used to determine whether your physiology is normal. So someone can feel exhausted, foggy, and less resilient than they used to, while their labs technically sit inside a broad statistical range. They're told nothing's wrong, which leads people to question their own experience. But the body is really that confusing. When energy declines, when recovery slows, when motivation feels different, there's almost always a physiological reason behind it. You just have to look at the system as a whole instead of chasing one isolated number. Let's start with cortisol. Cortisol gets demonized constantly in the health space, but it's actually one of the most important hormones in the body. It mobilizes energy. It sharpens alertness. It helps you respond to stress and challenges. High performers rely on healthy cortisol signaling every single day. So the problem isn't with cortisol itself. The problem is when the daily rhythm of cortisol breaks down. Under ideal conditions, cortisol rises sharply in the morning, shortly after waking. That rise helps you feel alert, focused, and ready to engage with the day. From there, it gradually declines throughout the day. By evening, it should be relatively low so that melatonin can rise and deep sleep can occur. But chronic stress changes the rhythm. Instead of rising strongly in the morning and declining smoothly throughout the day, cortisol patterns often flatten. Morning cortisol becomes weaker, afternoon energy dips harder, and evening cortisol stays elevated much longer than it should. That combination produces a very recognizable experience. You wake up tired. You rely heavily on caffeine in the morning. You crash mid-afternoon. And then oddly enough, your brain becomes more alert late at night when you should be winding down. That pattern alone can drive a huge amount of fatigue and burnout that people experience after 40. But cortisol is only one piece of the puzzle. Next comes thyroid signaling. Your thyroid governs metabolic speed. It helps determine how efficiently your cells convert nutrients into usable energy. When thyroid function drifts even slightly, the entire metabolic system slows. Energy production becomes less efficient. Cold sensitivity increases. Fatigue becomes easier to trigger. But again, This is where surface level labs often miss the story, because thyroid health isn't about TSH. It's about how effectively the body converts thyroid hormones into their active form at the cellular level. Chronic stress, inflammation, and poor metabolic health can interfere with that conversion. So someone's TSH may look normal on paper, while their cellular metabolism is still drastically underperforming. Then we get to sex hormones, testosterone in men, estrogen and progesterone in women. These hormones influence far more than reproduction. They affect things like motivation, confidence, recovery from training, muscle mass, metabolic efficiency, and just your overall drive. Now, here's where my own story briefly intersects with this topic. Years ago, I experienced firsthand what it feels like when hormone signaling drops far enough to affect my daily performance. The energy shift was very noticeable. The recovery shift was very noticeable. And it forced me to start asking better questions about what was actually happening inside my system. That process eventually led me deep into the physiology behind metabolic health, nervous system regulation, and hormonal signaling. Because what I discovered is something that many high performers never hear. And that is, hormones do not operate in isolation. They follow the state of the systems that lie above them. Those systems are mitochondrial energy production, metabolic stability, nervous system regulation, and circadian rhythm. When those upstream systems drift, hormone signaling follows, which is why chasing hormones alone rarely solves the real problem. And in the next little bit, we're going to cover that a little bit more on a deeper level, that hierarchy. Because once you understand how metabolism, mitochondria, and the nervous system shape hormone signaling, the entire burnout and fatigue pattern after 40 starts to make a lot more sense. So let's move upstream a little bit. Because if you really want to understand why hormone patterns drift after 40, you have to look at the systems that control them. Hormones do not operate independently. They respond to the metabolic environment of the body. And the metabolic environment is largely determined by three things. 1, mitochondrial energy production. 2, blood sugar stability. And 3, nervous system regulation. When those systems are strong, hormone signaling tends to be strong. When those systems are unstable, hormone patterns begin drifting, even if the glands themselves are technically working. This is where a lot of the health conversation becomes misleading. People focus on the output, testosterone levels, thyroid numbers, cortisol measurements, and etc., without examining the environment that those hormones are operating in. But hormones respond to context. Let's start with mitochondria, because this is the engine that drives everything. Mitochondria are the structure inside your cells responsible for producing ATP. ATP is the basic unit of energy that the body uses to do work. Every process that keeps you functioning depends on ATP. Your brain uses ATP to process information. Your muscles use ATP to contract. Your immune system uses ATP to repair tissue and regulate inflammation. Your endocrine system, the system that produces hormone, also requires ATP to function properly. If mitochondrial energy production becomes inefficient, then the body has fewer biological resources available for everything else. And one of the first things that begins to change is hormone signaling. The body is very intelligent about resource allocation. When energy availability becomes constrained, the system prioritizes survival processes over optimization processes. Reproduction and high-performance hormone signaling become a much lower priority, which means testosterone can drift downward. Thyroid signaling can slow slightly. Cortisol rhythms become more erratic. None of that happens because the body is broken. It happens because the energy environment changed. Now, let's add the next layer. Blood sugar stability. Your brain requires a constant supply of glucose to function efficiently. If blood sugar swings dramatically throughout the day, large spikes followed by drops, the nervous system has to compensate. Stress hormones get involved. Cortisol rises to mobilize glucose. Adrenaline increases to stabilize your energy. Those responses are incredibly useful in short bursts. But when they happen repeatedly throughout the day, they create a chronic stress environment inside your body. Chronic stress environments influence hormone signaling directly. Testosterone production becomes less efficient. Thyroid hormone conversion slows. Inflammation will tend to increase, all of which further reduces energy production. And now, as you can see, you've got a loop. Unstable metabolism creates stress signaling. Stress signaling disrupts hormone patterns. Your disrupted hormone patterns weaken metabolic stability even further. So this is one of the reasons that high performers often find themselves in a very strange cycle after 40. They're still pushing hard, but the internal systems that support that effort are becoming less stable. So now we have to bring in the nervous system, because this is the command center that coordinates all of this. The nervous system determines whether your body is operating in a performance state or recovery state. Sympathetic activation, the fight or flight response, mobilizes energy very quickly. It's useful during intense work, demanding training, or acute stress. But the body is not designed to remain in that state constantly. Recovery and repair occur during parasympathetic activation. That is the state where inflammation clears, tissues repair, and hormonal signals rebalance. High performers often spend the majority of their day in sympathetic activation, problem solving, decision making, deadlines, financial pressure, responsibility for teams and organizations. When you add intense exercise on top of that, and then you add caffeine and add inconsistent sleep, eventually the nervous system stops shifting gears easily. It remains partially activated even during periods when the body should be recovering. And when the nervous system stays in that heightened alert state, hormone systems and hormone rhythms struggle to stabilize. Cortisol remains elevated longer into the evening. Melatonin struggles to rise properly. Sleep depth declines. Your testosterone production during sleep declines. Thyroid conversion becomes much less efficient under chronic stress as well. All of these changes begin stacking on top of one another, which is why someone can feel like their hormones are off, even if a single lab value doesn't look dramatic. It's not one hormone failing. It's the entire regulatory system drifting under chronic load. And this is the part that most people never hear. You cannot fix a stress metabolic system by focusing on hormones alone. You have to stabilize the upstream environment first. Energy production, metabolic rhythm, and nervous system regulation. When these systems begin functioning properly again, hormone signaling often improves naturally, which is exactly why the approach I use with clients, the assess method, begins upstream. Before we talk about testosterone optimization, before we talk about thyroid meds, before we talk about any form of hormone therapy, we examine the biological hierarchy. How well are the mitochondria producing energy? Is blood sugar stable across the day? Is the nervous system capable of downshifting into recovery mode? Are circadian rhythms aligned with light and sleep patterns? Only once these systems are evaluated does it make sense to analyze hormone levels in context, because hormones are messengers. They respond to the environment that they operate in. And if that environment is chaotic, the signals they send will reflect that chaos. In this final bit, we're going to talk about what rebuilding the system actually looks like, because the good news is the body is incredibly adaptable. Once the upstream systems stabilize, hormone patterns often begin correcting themselves far more quickly than people would expect. So now the question becomes one that actually matters. If hormones follow the state of your metabolism, your mitochondria, and nervous system, how do you rebuild the system so that those signals begin stabilizing again? Because this is where a lot of people go in the wrong direction. They jump straight into hormone manipulation, more supplements, more optimization protocols, sometimes even hormone replacement therapy before the biological environment supporting those hormones has been stabilized. So let me be very clear about something. Hormone therapy absolutely has its place when it's done correctly and at the right point in the process. I'm not anti-TRT. I am not anti-hormone therapy, not at all. I'm on TRT myself. But I'm for it when it's done intelligently and in the right physiological context. It can be absolutely life-altering. But the mistake most people make is treating hormones as if they exist independently from the rest of the system. They absolutely don't. Hormones are responding to the environment the body is operating in, which means if you want hormone signaling to stabilize, you have to rebuild the biological foundation that these hormones depend on. The first place to start is energy production. Your mitochondria determine whether your cells are producing energy efficiently or struggling to keep up with the demands placed on them. When mitochondrial output is strong, your physiology has the resources it needs to maintain stable hormone signaling. When mitochondrial output is weak, the body begins conserving energy. That conservation shows up in a number of ways. Testosterone signaling can weaken. Thyroid conversion can slow down. Recovery becomes slower. Motivation and drive begin to feel different. Rebuilding mitochondrial function requires addressing the inputs that affect cellular energy. Consistent movement, resistance training to maintain muscle mass, aerobic work that improves oxygen utilization and mitochondrial density. These signals tell the body that energy production is needed and should be maintained. Then comes metabolic stability. Blood sugar stability plays a massive role in hormonal balance, even though most people never hear that connection explained. Large glucose swings throughout the day trigger repeated stress responses. Cortisol raises to stabilize blood sugar. Adrenaline gets involved. Inflammatory signaling increases. All of that creates an internal environment that disrupts hormonal signaling over time. When blood sugar becomes stable through consistent meals, balanced nutrition, and adequate protein intake, the nervous system no longer needs to be consistently triggering those stress responses. Energy becomes more predictable. Hormone rhythms begin stabilizing again. And then we come to something that many high performers underestimate: the nervous system. Your nervous system determines whether the body is operating in performance mode or recovery mode. High achievers spend most of their waking hours in sympathetic activation, focused, driven, solving problems, handling responsibility. That state is essential for leadership and productivity. But if the system never downshifts into parasympathetic recovery, the repair processes that support hormone production never fully activate. Hormones like testosterone are produced primarily during sleep. Thyroid signaling becomes more efficient when the nervous system is not under chronic stress. Cortisol rhythms normalize when the body has clear transitions between stimulation and recovery. If the nervous system remains on alert around the clock, those signals become drifting, which is why deliberate downshifting matters. Things like evening walks, time away from screens before bed is a big one. Breathing practices that calm the nervous system. Moments where the body receives the signal that it's safe to move out of constant alertness. These signals restore rhythm that the endocrine system depends on. Then we arrive at circadian timing. Hormones operate in daily rhythms. Cortisol rises in the morning, melatonin rises in the evening, growth hormone pulses during deep sleep. Testosterone production peaks overnight. If circadian signals become inconsistent, late nights, irregular sleep schedules, and constant artificial light, the hormone system struggles to maintain that rhythm. Restoring circadian alignment is one of the most powerful things you can do for your hormonal health. Things like morning light exposure, consistent sleep timing, allowing the nervous system to wind down naturally at night. These signals reinforce the biological clock that coordinates hormone release. When all of these systems begin stabilizing, something very interesting happens. Hormone signaling often improves without extreme interventions. Energy improves, recovery improves, motivation returns. And that person often feels more like themselves again. And this is exactly why the framework I use with clients, the assess method, starts with upstream physiology. We analyze mitochondrial output. We analyze metabolic stability, nervous system regulation, and circadian rhythm. Only after those systems are evaluated do we start looking really closely at hormone signaling. Because hormones make far more sense when you understand the environment that they're operating in. Once that hierarchy is addressed, the body becomes far more responsive to any interventions that might be needed later. And sometimes, simply restoring those upstream systems is enough to bring hormone patterns back into a healthy range. That's the part that many high performers find actually encouraging. The decline they've been feeling isn't necessarily permanent. Most of the times it's not. It's often the result of a biological system that's been running under chronic load without the support structures that allow it to recover. Once those support structures are rebuilt, the system can regain a surprising amount of resilience. Energy improves, focus returns, recovery becomes faster again, and that edge that many people assume was lost due to aging begins to reappear. Because the truth is this: your drive probably hasn't declined. Your discipline hasn't declined. The infrastructure supporting that performance simply needs to be recalibrated. And when you recalibrate it correctly, the physiology that powers high performance becomes sustainable again. If you want to begin stabilizing those systems, the 30-day Executive Energy Reset Blueprint walks through the exact sequence for rebuilding metabolic stability, nervous system regulation, and energy production. Links in the description. It is a free 30-day program. And remember this: you do not tolerate mediocrity in your business. Don't tolerate it in your biology. I'll see you all very soon. Take care.